Chapter 40. The question of what to do with people when it comes time to discharge them from hospital can be vexed. Available options are often limited, and there are few, if any, that actually support a person to get back on their own feet. This is because a person can't fully reclaim their independence and autonomy from inside an institution, even in the smaller care facilities. Moving a person from one institution to another, for example, discharging from hospital to a rehabilitation house, a therapy centre or supported accommodation, only prolongs that person's re-entry to the world at large. And the longer they remain in an institutional setting, the less likely it becomes that the person will ever make a successful transition to living outside of the mental health system. New Zealand's current policy climate is that of post-deinstitutionalisation. That is, we're in the phase of the aftermath of dismantling the large psychiatric hospitals that occurred in New Zealand over the last 15 to 20 years. This climate has seen a multitude of smaller institutions spring up, with varying degrees of success at moving people out of the mental health system and on to independent living. Doubtless through fear and stigma, conscious or unconscious on the part of health administrators, deinstitutionalisation has largely failed to capitalise on the opportunity to develop creative initiatives that might stop or slow the swinging of the psychiatric revolving door. Instead, many ex-patients feel that they have been merely downsized from big institutions to smaller ones. Some of the old ways of thinking about mental illness amongst the health and helping professions has persisted into these new environments. Part of the reason for this is that many of the hospital staff who would lose their jobs on closure of the large psychiatric hospitals took their own institutionalised beliefs with them into the new community-based workforce. After all, it wasn't just the patients who exhibited traits of being institutionalised. Staff had often worked in the closed hospital environment for many years, and their methods were formed inside the distinct culture of the wards. The new community-based mental health practice has required a new ethos and presented a challenge to old beliefs that a person has their diagnosis for life and is unable to recover. After all, if patients were no longer going to be in hospitals and were no longer even called patients, then should we still be defined as sick? But the indelible perception has persisted that people with mental illnesses need containment, control and incessant monitoring to keep ourselves and others safe. That if we're acting dangerous and crazy, we will be like that forever, and if we're not, then we still might, and only excessive amounts of medication will keep us in the mental state that we apparently need to be in. And you think the nanny state interferes with your life? Finding and keeping accommodation is a big issue for people who have been in psychiatric care. Supported accommodation is usually provided in group homes, with the exception of some one-bedroom situations. In Nelson, these are often in converted motels. These quarters provide important stability and tenure for tenants, but you have to agree to the support workers who come with the package. And unsurprisingly, given the small size of our survivor communities, people have found themselves being placed into accommodation with people they don't like or who have bad history with. Some levels in the supported accommodation framework provided for the person to lease the flat from the provider with no support worker attached, but these options were cut from the health budget. Tenants were either left to the vagaries of the free market or moved into facilities with a higher level of intervention. In our region, the uptake of these options had been popular with people who needed the security and stability of these arrangements, but not the full supervision. The loss of these levels was challenged by mental health service users, as these were the only levels in the framework that reflected an assumption that people could recover sufficiently to regain their autonomy. But nobody listened to the outcry. The policymakers once again threw the lives of vulnerable people into disarray with the stroke of a pen and decided upon what they thought was the most cost-effective option and where dollars should be spent. In today's competitive funding climate, It seems that unless you are in a high state of dependence and need a lot of minding, you are no longer eligible for anything much. The incentive is towards perpetuating illness, because service users perceive that if they become too well, they will lose their accommodation. Genuine support for people to work towards living independently of the mental health system took another giant leap backwards. After my stepfather died in 2001, I accompanied my mother to London to visit his family. We stayed in a hostel in the heart of the city, and here I had my first close-up encounter with homelessness. Walking to and from the hostel, we would literally be stepping over people who were living and sleeping on the streets, lucky to have a blanket or sleeping bag to cover them in the chill autumn air. The number and condition of these street people appalled me. Why, I asked my London stepfamily, what has gone wrong in our world that in affluent Western economies all these people just have nowhere to go? Oh, they have somewhere to go, was the reply. It was explained to me that the hostels and halfway houses available to people are so rough and dangerous that they prefer to take their chances on the street rather than try and survive living in the accommodation. Many of the homeless are people discharged from psychiatric care. Of course they are. Presumably this is what is meant by community care, a cardboard box and a blanket and your own little patch of the footpath right in the heart of the community. Where are we in New Zealand in relation to this scenario? Complacency, lack of quality resources, and the lack of a caring ethic and imperative driving healthcare practice will lead us there too. It has already started. It may come as a surprise to learn that much mental health policy in New Zealand has been heavily influenced by the service user movement, and these communities have been actively involved in its drafting. A lot of mental health policy is actually very sound and has embedded within it the language of recovery and empowerment. Things more often fall down at the level of service provision, where there has been a reluctance to embrace policy direction and an ambivalence towards partnering up with consumers in service delivery. I believe the reason for this is simple. Once again, it comes down to fear. Healthcare providers in New Zealand are becoming increasingly exposed to the risk of litigation. The people in the mental health system who have the power to change direction and embrace the new paradigms fear being held responsible if recovery strategies do not deliver successful results 100% of the time. Remember I mentioned earlier the right of people to make mistakes? Health professionals are also not allowed. Our current name, shame and blame culture leaves little room for creative responses and new strategies in mental health care. To the medical profession, consumer participation in service provision just seems too risky. To the consumers, not having it is where the real risk lies. Quote, old buildings can be pulled down and new ones put up almost overnight, but it is harder to deal with the invisible structures, the medieval castles of fear and suspicion. So wrote Janet Frame.